What happened to royal women accused of witchcraft? Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time when candles were the brightest lights in most rooms. When people thought comets were omens of doom. And when an unfortunate draft in a castle could be blamed on sorcery. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's settle into one of history's quieter corners. We're talking about royal women. Specifically, what happened when royal women were accused of witchcraft. Which, unsurprisingly, was almost never good news for them. You see, it wasn't enough that queens and princesses had to survive endless childbirth, political marriages to men they'd never met, and the occasional poison plot. They also had to worry about being accused of fraternizing with demons. Because, naturally, if crops failed or the king stubbed his toe, someone had to be responsible. And heaven forbid it was the king himself. No, far better to pin the blame on the woman sitting beside him at dinner. Let's drift first to Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester. Eleanor was the wife of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Now Humphrey was the uncle of King Henry VI of England, which put Eleanor rather close to the royal action. But Humphrey also had a habit of collecting enemies like other people collected prayer beads. And Eleanor? She wasn't exactly a shrinking violet. In the 1440s, she made the tactical error of consulting astrologers. Which was fine, until someone whispered that she'd been asking them when King Henry VI might die. That is not a good question to be caught asking. Before long, she was accused of witchcraft and treason, because of course those two always went together in the medieval mind. Her astrologer friends were executed in lively ways. Eleanor herself was spared death, but not dignity. She was forced to perform a public penance, walking barefoot through London while carrying a candle. Imagine being humiliated in front of every fishmonger and gossip in the city, while your enemies smirked from the sidelines. After that, she was locked away in various castles until she died. So, what happened to Eleanor? She went from duchess to disgraced prisoner, all for dabbling in horoscopes. The lesson, apparently, was that asking the stars about the king's lifespan was considered witchcraft. Asking the stars about whether your crops would grow? Perfectly fine. Let's drift forward to another royal entanglement with witchcraft, Joan of Navarre, Queen of England. She was the second wife of King Henry IV. After his death, she lived rather comfortably as Dowager Queen. Until 1419, when her stepson Henry V decided that he was short on cash and patience. Joan was accused of attempting to kill him with sorcery. Conveniently, this allowed him to confiscate her lands and revenues. She was locked away in Pevensey Castle, though not treated too harshly. She was, after all, a queen. After several years, Henry V relented, restored her lands, and released her. She lived out her days quietly, probably trying very hard not to breathe in a way that might be mistaken for spellcasting. Her case shows a recurring pattern. Witchcraft accusations against royal women were often less about genuine belief in magic and more about politics, money, or power struggles. If a dowager queen owned too much land, suddenly she was a sorceress. If a duchess got too ambitious, suddenly she was summoning demons. It was never about the magic. It was always about the politics. Now let's float over to the French court, where the accusations got a little more colorful. In the late 14th century, Valentina Visconti, Duchess of Orléans, found herself the subject of whispered campaigns. Valentina was the daughter of the Duke of Milan and had married Louis, Duke of Orléans, brother to King Charles VI of France. Her husband was assassinated in 1407, during one of those French civil wars that seemed to be happening every other Tuesday. After his murder, Valentina was suspected of using sorcery to avenge him, or perhaps even to influence King Charles VI's mental illness. Charles, by the way, was prone to bouts of psychosis, during which he believed he was made of glass. And yes, people genuinely thought Valentina's Italian blood and mysterious habits might be responsible. She was accused of practicing necromancy, though no trial ever took place. Instead, she was simply pushed further to the margins, her reputation darkened, and she died not long after. In the court of Paris, Italians were already suspicious. Add in a bit of widowhood, and suddenly you were a witch. If you're sensing a theme, widowhood, land ownership, inconvenient political alliances, then yes, that's the pattern. The witchcraft accusation was the Swiss Army knife of political tools. Now, perhaps the most famous case, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. Poor Anne has been accused of many things: adultery, incest, treason, and yes, witchcraft. Henry VIII's court whispered that she had bewitched the king, which, to be fair, might have been the only explanation for why he overturned his entire kingdom's religion to marry her. Anne was accused of using charms and spells to lure Henry into marriage. Even her physical features were dragged into the witchcraft narrative. Rumors circulated that she had an extra finger or a strange mole, classic signs of a witch's mark. When Henry grew tired of her, the charges of witchcraft resurfaced conveniently alongside adultery and treason. Of course, she was executed in 1536. Officially, it was for treason. But the witchcraft rumors gave the whole affair a lurid edge, making it easier for people to accept that their once beloved queen needed to lose her head. Because it's always easier to kill a woman if you first convince the public she's in league with the devil. Anne wasn't the only Tudor woman tangled in these ideas. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was accused mainly of adultery, but whispers of dark influence floated around her too. When you marry Henry VIII, your odds of being accused of something, witchcraft, treason, or simply existing too cheerfully, rise dramatically. Let's take a quieter step north, to Scotland, where King James VI, later James I of England, became almost obsessed with witchcraft. He even wrote a book called Daemonology, which is not exactly the light bedtime reading we're aiming for tonight. Under his reign, noble women were swept up in witchcraft trials, especially if they were connected to factions he distrusted. One notable case was that of Lady Glamis, Janet Douglas. She was accused of plotting against King James V, James VI's grandfather, and charged with witchcraft as a convenient add-on. She was burned at the stake in 1537, a gruesome death more fitting for a supposed common witch than a noblewoman. But the point wasn't justice. The point was eliminating a rival family. So, what happened to royal women accused of witchcraft? Rarely execution, unless they were very unlucky, like Lady Glamis or Anne Boleyn. More often, they were imprisoned, humiliated, stripped of lands, or quietly shuffled out of the political arena. Witchcraft was simply a flexible label for woman we need to get rid of. It's worth noting that few people truly believed these queens and duchesses were brewing potions in dungeons. The accusations served their purpose. They painted powerful women as unnatural, dangerous, and unfit for influence. And once that image stuck, it didn't matter whether or not they'd ever lit a candle the wrong way. Imagine, if you will, being a queen in the 15th century. You've survived smallpox, multiple childbirths, and possibly an arranged marriage to a man twice your age. Your reward? If you smile too much, you're flirting. If you frown too much, you're plotting. And if the king develops a headache, someone might just accuse you of summoning demons. It was a delicate balance. Royal women walked a tightrope where the slightest misstep could lead to whispers of sorcery. And those whispers could strip away everything: your wealth, your freedom, even your life. But here's the quiet irony. The very idea of accusing queens of witchcraft only reinforced how much influence they truly had. If they'd been powerless, no one would have bothered inventing such charges. No one accuses a laundress of hexing the king. They accuse his queen. Because she sits beside him at table. She hears his secrets. She shapes his decisions. And that was threatening enough to invent a little witchcraft where none existed. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the flickering torchlight of a medieval court. Picture the queen, silent at the king's side, wearing heavy jewels and a heavier crown. Around her, whispers circulate. Not about the banquet or the music, but about the candle flame that flickered oddly when she walked in. That's all it would take. One flicker, one rumor, one accusation, and her world could unravel. Let's drift, now, toward our next royal fiasco. Did medieval peasants ever go on vacation? Hey everyone. Let's settle in again, breathe slowly, and drift a little further back through the mists of time. Tonight, after queens accused of witchcraft, we're turning our lantern light onto a much humbler subject. The medieval peasant. The person who, in most history books, is described with one word, toiling. But here's the question. Did medieval peasants ever go on vacation? The short answer is yes. Not in the way you or I might imagine, no sandy beaches, no novelty keychains from the gift shop. But peasants didn't actually work every single day of their lives until they collapsed, either. That image comes mostly from the 19th century, when industrialists wanted workers to believe that 12-hour factory shifts were normal. Medieval peasants, ironically, may have had more rest than some modern office workers. So let's wander into their world, slowly, like we're strolling down a muddy village lane. The medieval year was built around the church calendar. And the church calendar was generous. Holy days, feast days, saint days, there were a lot of them. By some estimates, peasants might have had as many as 80 to 100 days off each year, depending on the region and the century. Imagine that. A third of the year, free from labor, officially sanctioned by heaven itself. Now, of course, day off was a relative concept. On a saint's feast day, peasants weren't reclining in hammocks. They were more likely to be at church for hours, followed by communal meals, processions, and probably more ale than anyone strictly needed. Still, compared to swinging a scythe for 10 hours in the summer sun, it was a welcome change of pace. One of the biggest vacations of the medieval year was the annual village fair. These weren't like a modern county fair, though there were similarities: noisy stalls, dubious food, people shouting over each other to sell their wares. But medieval fairs were also major economic events, drawing merchants from towns and even other countries. For peasants, the fair was part marketplace, part entertainment, part pilgrimage. You could buy spices you'd only heard about in church sermons. You could hear wandering musicians. You could even, if you were particularly adventurous, watch trained bears dance for a coin. Which, in fairness, was the medieval equivalent of watching bad television. Everyone knew it wasn't high culture, but it passed the time. And then there were pilgrimages. These were, in a sense, medieval package holidays, though without the sunblock and poolside cocktails. A peasant might set out to visit the shrine of a saint, perhaps several days' walk away. The journey itself could be exhausting, but it was also a chance to escape the village routine. Along the way, you met strangers, shared bread with other pilgrims, and picked up stories you could tell for years afterward. Some peasants even made it to major pilgrimage destinations: Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or if you were truly ambitious and absurdly lucky, Rome or Jerusalem. Not many managed the last two, but it happened. Imagine trudging through unfamiliar towns, languages, and climates, all while hoping the relic at the end of the road would bless you with good fortune. But let's not romanticize too much. For most peasants, vacation was closer to a day when you weren't bent over in a field. And yet, those days mattered. Weddings, for example, were often treated as community holidays. The whole village attended, whether they were invited or not. There would be dancing, feasting, and occasionally, drunken brawls that the priest would have to sort out the next morning. And then there was Christmas. A true medieval Christmas was less about gift-giving and more about eating until you couldn't move. For 12 days straight, people feasted, sang, and occasionally acted out bawdy plays that the clergy tolerated only grudgingly. If you were a peasant, it was one of the rare times you might taste meat in abundance. A goose, perhaps, or if your lord was feeling generous, a share of venison. It was as close to a holiday resort as you were going to get. Now, here's where it gets slightly ironic. While peasants were enjoying their feast days and fairs, their lords were not always thrilled about it. From the perspective of a noble, all those holy days were lost productivity, which meant lost income. But challenging the church on its calendar was not a wise move, even for the most powerful baron. So, peasants got their feast days, while nobles grumbled quietly over their ledgers. That said, the church itself sometimes worried peasants were having a little too much fun. Records survive of clerics scolding villagers for turning feast days into drunken revelry. But, of course, that's what most people did. If you'd been eating porridge for weeks, and suddenly you had ale and roasted meat, moderation was not really on the table. And yes, let's address the work schedule itself. Peasants worked hard, especially during planting and harvest. But the medieval day wasn't a straight 12-hour slog. People worked in bursts, with pauses for meals, rest, and even naps. In many places, the custom of the afternoon siesta was alive and well. Which means medieval peasants might have had more nap opportunities than the average modern employee with a coffee habit. There's also evidence that during winter, when fields lay dormant, peasants worked less. They still had chores, of course, mending tools, feeding animals, hauling wood. But compared to the frantic pace of summer, winter was quieter. In some households, it meant long evenings by the hearth, telling stories, spinning wool, or simply sitting in silence while the wind howled outside. Hardly a beach vacation, but restful in its own way. Now, let's not pretend every peasant lived a life of leisure punctuated by ale festivals. Life expectancy was low. Disease was constant. And if your lord decided he needed extra labor, you didn't exactly get to opt out. But the idea that peasants were relentlessly overworked is misleading. Their schedules were shaped by the seasons, the church, and the community, all of which built in pauses. Let's picture it. You're a peasant in, say, 13th century France. You rise with the sun, spend the morning tending crops, break for a meal of bread and cheese, return to the field, then stop again when the church bell tolls. A few weeks later, it's the feast of St. Martin. Work halts. The whole village gathers. Someone roasts a pig. The local priest gives a sermon that no one listens to, because the ale is flowing. By evening, the children are asleep in haystacks, and the adults are singing songs they'll regret remembering. That was vacation enough. What about travel? Beyond pilgrimages and fairs, did peasants ever just wander? The answer is yes, though not in large numbers. Some became seasonal laborers, moving from village to village for harvest. Others took work building cathedrals or castles, which meant years away from home. While not vacations in the relaxing sense, they were breaks from village monotony. And then there were festivals with a touch of chaos. Carnival, for example, just before Lent, turned normal order upside down. People wore masks, mocked authority, and behaved badly, knowing it would all be forgiven once fasting began. For a few days each year, peasants got to laugh at their betters, sometimes even parodying the clergy. That sort of freedom was rare, and precious. In short, peasants didn't take vacations in the modern sense. They didn't pack a bag and say, "See you in 2 weeks." But they did have rest. They had festivals, holy days, pilgrimages, and winters of slower pace. Their world was harder than ours in many ways, but not as relentlessly joyless as the stereotype suggests. And here's a final thought to drift on. If a medieval peasant could time travel to today, they might find our working lives rather grim. Offices with fluorescent lights, 2 weeks of vacation a year if you're lucky, and constant emails. To them, it might look like we're the ones who never rest. And in a way, maybe we've forgotten the value of simply stopping. Of feast days, of gathering with neighbors, of marking time with community instead of deadlines. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself not in a cubicle, but in a muddy village square, watching jugglers while someone hands you a mug of ale. No emails. No alarms. Just the simple rhythm of life, broken by feast and festival, by pilgrimage and fair. A vacation, medieval style. And now, let's drift quietly on, toward our next historical curiosity. How did ancient children actually play? Hey everyone! Tonight, let's drift a little further back in time. Past medieval fairs and royal witch trials. Past castles and plagues. We're going to wander into the quiet, often overlooked world of ancient children. Now, when people imagine ancient childhood, they usually picture two extremes. Either children were tiny adults, already working in the fields or tending fires. Or they were fragile cherubs, dying of disease before the age of 5. Both images are partly true. Childhood was short, dangerous, and often interrupted. But when children weren't working or coughing, they were playing. Because children, no matter the century, find ways to play. Even in societies where adults forgot they were supposed to. So tonight, let's stroll slowly through the ancient playgrounds. They didn't have slides or swings. No brightly colored plastic. No cheerful jingles. But they had toys, games, and more imagination than we might think. We'll start with the ancient Egyptians. Archaeologists have found dolls buried in tombs, carved from wood, sometimes with real hair attached. Which is either charming or mildly unsettling, depending on how you feel about dolls that have lasted 3,000 years. Some dolls had movable limbs. Others were more like simple figurines. Children in Egypt also had toy animals on wheels, which they could pull with a string. The wheels weren't very sophisticated. Imagine dragging a little wooden cow across the sand, while it bumps along like a cart with a flat tire. That was entertainment. They also played games of skill. Knucklebones, for example, small animal bones used like dice. Children would toss them, catch them, and invent rules not unlike modern jacks. It was a way to pass time, to show off coordination, and to gamble, if you were slightly older and had something to lose. Now let's drift to ancient Greece, where children invented games that sound surprisingly familiar. They played a version of hide-and-seek. They had tag, called a podidraskinda, which is both a mouthful and proof that children have been chasing each other and shouting for thousands of years. They also had ball games, using inflated pig bladders. A little less glamorous than a Nike football, but it worked. Greek girls, meanwhile, played with dolls too. Some were simple clay figures. Others were surprisingly detailed, with jointed limbs and tiny accessories. Girls would sometimes dedicate their dolls to a goddess when they came of age, essentially saying goodbye to childhood. It's a little bittersweet, like leaving behind a stuffed animal before getting married. Only with more incense and solemnity. Greek boys, on the other hand, had a fondness for war games. Sticks became swords. Stones became projectiles. And occasionally, children accidentally invented the slingshot arms race a few centuries early. Because of course they did. Boys pretending to be warriors is the one constant across human history. Now, let's wander to ancient Rome, where toys and games multiplied like politicians. Roman children had wooden swords and shields, because naturally, the empire wanted to get them started early on the military path. They had dolls, some carved from ivory, with little wardrobes of miniature clothes. Wealthy children might even have toys made of silver, which, to be honest, sounds like a choking hazard waiting to happen. Romans loved board games. Children played them too, on carved stone boards or simple wooden sets. Games with dice, counters, and strategy. Sometimes gambling, sometimes just fun. Imagine a Roman child hunched over a board, muttering about bad luck, while his mother shouted that dinner was ready. Some things never change. Romans also had hoops to roll, balls to toss, and hobby horses to ride. Yes, hobby horses. Children galloped around on sticks with horse heads attached, pretending to be cavalry. Which is charming, until you remember that half of them probably did end up in actual cavalry, a decade or two later. Childhood play was rehearsal for adulthood. Let's not forget China, where children had their own playful traditions. Kites, for example, were invented in China. Imagine children running across fields, trailing delicate paper kites painted with birds or dragons. Adults used kites for signaling in war, but children used them simply for joy. They also played with tops, battled with crickets in tiny cages, and enjoyed games of shuttlecock, kicking a feathered object back and forth without letting it touch the ground. If that sounds suspiciously like hacky sack, that's because it basically was. The modern college student with a hacky sack circle is part of a tradition going back at least 2,000 years. In Mesoamerica, children played with rubber balls long before Europeans had figured out how to make anything bounce. The famous ball game of the Maya and Aztec was often ritualistic and sometimes deadly for adults. But for children, there were smaller, casual versions, tossing, bouncing, and chasing rubber balls through dusty streets. Children also had toys shaped like animals, carved from clay, sometimes with wheels. Which is an odd thought. Toy cars, thousands of years before actual cars. Across all these civilizations, you notice a pattern. Children didn't need much. A stick became a sword. A rock became a ball. A piece of string could be twisted into endless amusements. Play was simple, physical, and communal. And then there were lullabies and rhymes. Ancient parents sang to their children just as modern parents do. Some of those songs survive, scratched into clay tablets or quoted in passing. They're often about warding off spirits or begging the child to stop crying, which, frankly, is still the main theme of most lullabies. Please stop crying. That's timeless. Of course, not all play was innocent. Children could be cruel. Roman graffiti shows sketches of crude jokes, drawn by children with access to chalk and too much free time. Egyptian children carved rude little doodles into walls when teachers weren't looking. Some things really do never change. It's also worth remembering that many children didn't live long. Death was common, which made play all the more precious. The little doll buried in a tomb wasn't just a toy, it was a symbol of a life cut short, a reminder that even in brief childhood, there was joy. So, how did ancient children actually play? Much like modern ones. They chased each other. They made up rules. They laughed, shouted, and probably annoyed their parents endlessly. The toys looked different, but the spirit was the same. Children are natural improvisers. Give them an object, and they'll invent a game around it. Even if that object is a sheep's ankle bone. Let's imagine it. The sun is setting over an ancient village. Children are outside, tossing knuckle bones, while a little girl drags a wooden toy horse along the ground. Nearby, boys chase each other with sticks, pretending to be warriors. Parents call them in for supper, the way parents always do. And the children, reluctantly, abandon their games, promising each other they'll play again tomorrow. It's a quiet picture. No castles, no crowns, no grand battles. Just children, playing as they always have. And now, as we drift on, let's leave the children to their games, and turn our lantern back toward the adults, the ones making the real mess of history. Because our next step is into the lives of those who had power, and squandered it magnificently. What happened to soldiers who deserted in ancient armies? Hey everyone! Tonight, let's drift out of the village square and leave the children with their toys. We're going to follow another path. One that leads through dust, over battlefields, and into the ranks of ancient armies. Now, armies might sound a little too exciting for bedtime. Trumpets, shields clashing, men shouting in formation. But don't worry. We're not here for the battle scenes. We're here for the quiet, slightly embarrassing subject of desertion. Because not every soldier wanted to be there. Not every soldier stayed. And when men slipped away from their armies, sometimes in ones and twos, sometimes in whole groups, the consequences were rarely gentle. Let's drift first to ancient Rome, which had more rules about desertion than almost any other society. Rome loved discipline. Rome loved order. Rome also loved making examples out of anyone who broke those things. If a Roman soldier deserted, punishment could be brutal. Sometimes it was as simple as execution. Swift, public, and discouraging. Other times, commanders got creative. They might brand the deserter with a hot iron. They might beat him with clubs in front of the entire legion. And then there was decimation. It's a word we still use, but in Rome it was very literal. If a unit showed cowardice or mass desertion, the punishment was for 1 in 10 men to be executed, chosen by lot. The unlucky ones were beaten to death by their comrades. The lucky 9 got to watch and survive. Because nothing says team spirit quite like drawing lots to see if your friends get to bludgeon you. But here's the irony. Rome also needed soldiers desperately. If a deserter managed to slip away, avoid capture, and live quietly in the countryside, he might actually survive. Some even rejoined under a new name. The empire was too big to keep track of every runaway. Rome threatened loudly, but reality was a little more porous. Let's wander over to ancient Greece. Greek city-states had different approaches. In Sparta, desertion was basically the worst possible disgrace. If a Spartan soldier fled battle, he wasn't just punished. He was shunned. Called a trembler. Forced to live in shame. His family carried the dishonor too. It was a slow punishment, death by humiliation. In Athens, things were less extreme but still unpleasant. Cowardice or desertion meant loss of citizenship rights. Which, in a society that loved democracy, was a quiet form of exile. You became a man without a vote, without a voice. In a sense, you still lived in the city, but you didn't belong anymore. Now, let's drift further east, to the armies of the Persian Empire. The Persians were pragmatic. They commanded vast territories, with soldiers from many subject peoples. Desertion was inevitable. Punishment could be execution, yes, but it could also be enslavement. A deserter might find himself chained, not to a battlefield post, but to a royal construction project. One day you're carrying a spear, the next you're hauling stones for a king's palace. Not exactly a career upgrade. Meanwhile, in China, desertion was treated harshly under the Qin and Han dynasties. Laws prescribed flogging, mutilation, or death for deserters. Sometimes entire families were punished, to discourage anyone from running away. A soldier might think twice about sneaking home if he knew his parents or siblings would suffer for it. But again, reality was more complicated. China was vast. Borders were porous. Some deserters simply melted into rural life, reappearing in another province under a new identity. If you didn't mind changing your name and avoiding old acquaintances, you might just get away with it. Now let's look at Alexander the Great's army. His campaigns stretched for years. Soldiers marched thousands of miles, through deserts, mountains, and monsoons. Desertion was always a risk. Alexander was famously charismatic, but charisma doesn't always outweigh exhaustion and homesickness. When mutinies arose, Alexander often used a blend of threats and theatrics. He might execute ringleaders, but he also gave speeches designed to guilt his soldiers into staying. He reminded them of their glory, their duty, their share of the spoils, which is a polite way of saying he emotionally manipulated them until they picked up their spears again. It usually worked, though not without grumbling. Of course, sometimes entire armies deserted in spirit, if not in body. Soldiers might refuse to march further, as happened in India, where Alexander's men flatly said no to another campaign. He could hardly execute them all. So even the greatest conqueror in history found limits to discipline. Now, what about the Mongols? Their empire is remembered for speed, ferocity, and brutal discipline. Desertion was rare, but when it happened, punishment could extend to entire units or families. Genghis Khan was not fond of second chances. Yet Mongol soldiers also had strong bonds of loyalty, often built on kinship. Desertion wasn't just abandoning an army, it was abandoning your clan. For many, the social shame was worse than the military punishment. Across all these societies, one theme emerges: desertion was treated as both a crime and a sin against community. Armies didn't just see soldiers as individuals. They saw them as part of a whole. When one man left, he endangered the many. So punishment was public, symbolic, and designed to scare others. But here's the quiet irony. Desertion was also very human. Soldiers got tired. They missed home. They realized the pay wasn't worth the risk of being skewered by a spear. They slipped away at night, just like workers calling in sick to avoid the office, only with higher stakes. And sometimes, deserters even changed history. When entire groups defected to the enemy, they carried knowledge with them: routes, weaknesses, secrets. A few men sneaking off in the dark could tip the balance of a war. Which is why commanders feared it so deeply. Imagine it. You're a Roman soldier, stationed in some rainy outpost in Britain. You've been there for years, building walls, staring at damp hills. One night, you decide you've had enough. You slip out of camp, hoping the guard is too sleepy to notice. If you're caught, you'll be flogged, branded, maybe executed. If you succeed, you disappear into the countryside, live under a new name, maybe even marry a local. Your comrades curse you as a coward. But you sleep in a dry hut, far from the army's reach. Was it worth it? Possibly. Or picture a Spartan boy, raised to think cowardice is worse than death. He flees battle once, just once, and for the rest of his life, no one meets his eyes. Mothers point him out to their children as a warning. He eats alone. He dies alone. No ashes, no execution, just exile in the middle of his own city. Desertion wasn't always about fear. Sometimes it was about hunger. Armies often failed to feed their men properly. Starving soldiers slipped away simply to survive. Others deserted out of principle, refusing to fight for a cause they didn't believe in. Though in ancient armies, principle usually looked suspiciously like "I don't want to die today." So, what happened to soldiers who deserted in ancient armies? Some were executed. Some were mutilated. Some were shamed into silence. A few escaped, blending into the background of history. Enough escaped, in fact, that desertion remained a constant problem, despite all the threats. Because no matter the empire, Rome, Greece, Persia, China, soldiers were human. And humans, when pushed too far, look for the nearest exit. As you drift off tonight, imagine the flickering campfires of an ancient army. Men huddled in cloaks, muttering about food, pay, and home. Somewhere in the dark, one man makes a choice. He stands, gathers his things quietly, and slips away. Maybe he'll be caught. Maybe he won't. Maybe he'll vanish into history. Maybe he'll change it. But in that moment, He is simply tired. And very human. And with that, let's drift toward our next royal misstep, because soldiers weren't the only ones making bad choices. Kings and queens had plenty of their own. Did medieval peasants ever go on vacation? Hello again. Tonight we're not talking about pirates or cavemen. Tonight we're going to the countryside. To a world of muddy boots, smoky huts, and sheep that won't stay where you put them. We're going to spend some time with the medieval peasant. Now, if you picture a medieval peasant, you might imagine someone working endlessly from dawn until dusk. Bent over in the fields, swinging a scythe, covered in mud, never smiling, never resting. But here's the surprise, peasants didn't actually work all the time. In fact, compared to many people today, they might have had more days off. And not just because the harvest season ended. They had holidays, feast days, church days, and sometimes, a little thing we could almost call vacation. Not a vacation in the modern sense. There were no beach resorts, no all-inclusive buffets, no little airplanes in the sky carrying you to some warm coast. But there were breaks, travel, even chances to escape the routine. So let's wander through it slowly. The rhythm of work. First, the basics. Peasants worked hard, yes. Farming was labor-intensive, and most of it was done by hand. But they didn't work every single day of the year. They couldn't. The medieval calendar was full of feast days. Some years, peasants in Catholic Europe had as many as 100 holy days off work. Sundays, of course, plus saints' days, major feasts like Easter, Christmas, and Pentecost, and local holidays. On these days, work was restricted. Some tasks, like feeding animals or baking bread, still had to be done. But the heavy field work stopped. So even the poorest serf had enforced breaks scattered across the year. Were they lounging in hammocks? No. But they weren't chained to a plow every single day either. Local festivals. Now, what did peasants do with these days? They often went to church, of course. But they also gathered. Festivals were one of the highlights of rural life. A saint's feast day might mean music, dancing, games, and yes, drinking. It was one of the few times when a whole village came together without tools in their hands. There might be contests of strength, races, or ball games. People dressed in their best tunics. Young men and women eyed each other across the crowd. Gossip flowed as freely as ale. If you think of a vacation as time off from work spent with friends and family, well, festivals were the peasants' version of that. Pilgrimages, the medieval road trip. But here's where it gets closer to our modern idea of vacation: pilgrimages. Pilgrimage was religious, of course. People traveled to visit shrines, relics, or holy sites. Canterbury in England. Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Rome, if you were ambitious. But pilgrimage wasn't all solemn prayer. It was also adventure. Peasants walked for days or weeks, sleeping in inns or barns, meeting strangers along the way. Some even crossed seas. It was tiring, yes, but it was also liberating. A chance to see new places. To escape the Lord's manor. To eat different food. To collect a badge from the shrine and bring it proudly home. For some peasants, it was the only time they ever left their village. And it must have felt like the closest thing to vacation their world allowed. Fairs and markets. Another kind of break came with fairs. Big regional fairs drew merchants from far away. Cloth from Flanders, spices from the east, trinkets, jewelry, tools. A medieval peasant might save up coins for months to spend at a fair. And while trade was the main attraction, fairs were also entertainment. Jugglers, musicians, acrobats, ale tents, games of chance. Imagine being a peasant, whose daily life rarely changed, suddenly surrounded by strange accents, exotic goods, and the thrill of a traveling performance. It was noisy, overwhelming, and utterly different from the rhythm of the fields. That sounds like a vacation to me. Seasonal lulls. There was also the rhythm of the seasons. Peasants worked frantically during planting and harvest. But in the dead of winter, the fields rested. And so did they. Winter meant repairing tools, mending clothes, feeding animals. But it also meant long evenings by the fire, storytelling, singing, drinking, playing games. It wasn't a trip to the seaside, but it was time off. A slower pace. In some ways, the medieval winter break was their version of a quiet holiday season. Did they travel for fun? The big question, did peasants ever travel just for fun? The honest answer is, rarely. Travel was expensive, dangerous, and often unnecessary. Roads were poor, and most peasants had obligations that tied them to their lord's land. But there are hints that some did. A peasant might visit relatives in another village, or tag along with a merchant caravan for a short stretch. A lucky few might even join a group headed to a distant shrine and see the world beyond their parish. And for those who managed it, the experience must have been unforgettable. Imagine a farmer from a tiny English village standing in the vast square of a French cathedral town. The sights, the smells, the sheer size of it. It was the medieval equivalent of your first trip to a bustling foreign city. Leisure at home. Of course, not all vacations required travel. Sometimes peasants simply enjoyed leisure at home. They played games, dice, board games, ball games. They sang songs, told stories, and danced. They fished in rivers, gathered berries, or simply sat in the sun. Life was hard, yes, but it wasn't unrelenting misery. People made space for joy, because joy was necessary. So did they or didn't they? So, did medieval peasants ever go on vacation? If by vacation you mean lying on a beach with a drink in your hand, no. That idea didn't exist. But if you mean a break from daily labor, a chance to travel or celebrate, a pocket of leisure in a hard life, then yes. They had festivals, pilgrimages, fairs, and seasonal lulls that gave them time away from the grind. Their vacations weren't glamorous. But to someone who worked the same fields every day, even a trip to the next town for a saint's day must have felt like a world away. A final picture. So let's close our eyes and picture it. It's midsummer. The fields are green, but today, no one works them. The church bells have rung, calling the village together for a feast. Children run with ribbons in their hair. Men drink ale by the barrel. Women gossip in their best linen dresses. Music drifts from the square. For one day, no one worries about the plow or the Lord's demands. For one day, they laugh, dance, and rest. It's not a beach resort. But for the medieval peasant, it's vacation enough. And with that, let's drift off, a little more grateful for our own breaks, and a little more aware that even the hardest lives find time for joy. How did ancient children actually play? Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back again. Past the feasts of medieval peasants and the anxious witch trials of unlucky queens. We're going further, into the quieter world of ancient childhood. Now, childhood in the past tends to get overlooked. Historians used to talk about children as if they didn't really exist. Not in the way we think of them now. Some even claimed medieval or ancient parents didn't really love their children, because so many died young. Which is a bleak and slightly unfair way of looking at it. People mourned. They cared. And they also gave children space to do what children always do, play. So let's wander, slowly and gently, through ancient playgrounds. They didn't look like ours. No plastic slides, no swing sets, no carefully padded floors. But there were toys, games, and enough imagination to turn almost anything into fun. Because if history proves anything, it's that children will find ways to play, even in the harshest conditions. Toys in ancient Egypt. We can start along the Nile. In the tombs of ancient Egypt, archaeologists have found little treasures that once belonged to children. Dolls carved from wood, painted, sometimes with hair made from string or actual human hair, which is either charming or the beginning of a horror film, depending on your tolerance for dolls that last 3,000 years. Some toys had moving limbs. Others were simple figurines. Children also pulled little wooden animals on wheels, dogs, cows, even crocodiles. Imagine dragging a squeaky, lopsided toy across the packed earth while your older brother tried to push you out of the way. That was entertainment. Games of chance and skill were popular too. Children played with knuckle bones, literally animal ankle bones. Tossed in the air, caught, and scored in ways that resemble modern jacks. It was a pastime for kids, and also a gambling tool for adults. You might say it was the ancient version of a toy that mysteriously becomes not yours once your father notices it could win him some beer money. Greek games. From Egypt, let's wander across the sea to Greece. Greek children had toys too, rattles for infants, spinning tops, hoops to roll along the ground. They also had dolls made of clay or wax, some with jointed arms and legs. Girls often gave up their dolls in a small ceremony when they reached marriageable age, dedicating them to Artemis or Aphrodite. It's both sweet and sad, like leaving behind your stuffed animals when society decides you're suddenly grown. Greek boys, unsurprisingly, had a fondness for mock battles. Sticks for swords, stones for missiles, shouts loud enough to irritate every parent within range. They played a patadraskinda, which was essentially hide-and-seek, and ball games using inflated pig bladders. Not glamorous, but functional. If you've ever kicked around a half-flat football, you know the feeling. And yes, the Greeks were already inventing competitive sports for children. Running, wrestling, throwing things. Because of course they were. Why wait until adulthood to start building the next Olympian? Roman pastimes. The Romans, being Romans, had to do everything bigger. Children had dolls made not only of wood or clay, but sometimes ivory. Wealthy families even gave their children miniature wardrobes of doll clothing. The ancient version of Barbie's dream closet, only with fewer pink sequins and more toga options. Roman children rolled hoops, played with hobby horses, and had toy chariots, small carts to pull around, pretending to be drivers in the circus. Board games were popular, too. Dice, counters, little grids scratched onto stone steps. Imagine a Roman child hunched over his board, muttering about bad rolls while his mother yelled at him to come inside. That part hasn't changed in 2,000 years. They also played war. Wooden swords, little shields, mock skirmishes in courtyards. It was all fun until someone got an eye poked out. Then it was training for the legions. Childhood was, in many ways, practice for adulthood. Ancient China. Across the world, children in ancient China had their own delights. They flew kites, beautiful paper shapes painted like birds or dragons. Adults sometimes used them for signaling in warfare. Children just ran with them for joy. There were tops to spin, balls to kick, and games of shuttlecock, a feathered object kept in the air with feet. If that sounds suspiciously like hacky sack, that's because it was. The tradition is over 2,000 years old, and somewhere, right now, a college student with a beanie is keeping the circle alive. They also played with toy carts, rattles, and little carved animals. And when winter came, they slid across frozen rivers, inventing their own ice games long before modern skates. Childhood ingenuity has never really needed much equipment. Mesoamerican play. Now let's drift to Mesoamerica. The Maya and Aztec had rubber long before Europe did, which meant children could play with bouncy rubber balls centuries before anyone in the Old World thought of it. Adults used those balls for the great ritual ball game, sometimes with very serious stakes. But children had smaller, casual versions, bouncing, tossing, and chasing rubber spheres in the dust. Clay animal toys with wheels have also been found in Mesoamerican sites, which is curious, because no one used wheels for transport there. Apparently, wheels were considered fun for toys, but not worth putting under a cart. Children had toy animals that rolled, but their parents still carried firewood on their backs. A strange quirk of history, and a reminder that play and practicality don't always overlap. Everyday improvisations. Of course, most ancient children didn't have finely carved dolls or imported toys. They made do. Sticks, stones, bones, scraps of cloth. A broken pot became a drum. A flat stone became a target. A circle scratched in dirt became a game board. Children are experts at turning whatever is around them into something fun. And they always have been. Songs, rhymes, and mischief. Play wasn't just physical. Children sang songs and chanted rhymes. A few scraps of lullabies survive, written down on clay tablets or papyrus. Most are pleas for the child to stop crying, which proves some things really are eternal. Parents everywhere sing the same song, "Please, please, for the love of all the gods, go to sleep." Children also carved little doodles. Roman walls, Egyptian ostraca, bits of pottery, all bear the scrawls of bored kids with access to something sharp. Some are crude drawings of animals or stick figures. Others are rude jokes. The urge to vandalize the nearest surface with questionable art seems to be one of humanity's most consistent traits. The fragile joy of play. It's worth remembering that ancient childhood was short. Many children didn't survive illness, hunger, or accident, which makes their play all the more poignant. A wooden doll in a tomb wasn't just a toy. It was a symbol of a little life, cherished even in loss. And yet, when we look at the toys and games that survive, what we see most clearly is continuity. Children, even in the harshest times, found joy. They laughed, chased, argued, cheated at games, and sulked when they lost. They teased each other. They invented rules. They made up worlds. A quiet picture. So let's picture it, softly. The sun is low over an ancient village. Children run barefoot, chasing a hoop across the dirt. A little girl drags a wooden toy animal behind her, the string fraying. Boys throw sticks at a tree, shouting about who hit hardest. A toddler shakes a rattle. Parents call them in for food. Nothing grand. Nothing that makes it into history books about kings or battles. But history isn't only kings and battles. It's also children, playing until the light fades. And with that picture, let's leave them to their games, and drift forward again. Back toward the adults, and all the chaos they created. Because for every child chasing a hoop, There was a soldier wondering whether to stay in the ranks, or quietly slip away. Which brings us to our next wondering thought: what happened to soldiers who deserted in ancient armies? What happened to soldiers who deserted in ancient armies? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting away from children's games and village feast days, and we're stepping, quietly, into the ranks of ancient armies. The air is heavy with the smell of campfires and unwashed leather. The sound of marching feet echoes across the plain. And somewhere in the middle of all this, one soldier is thinking, I don't actually want to be here. Desertion. It's one of the oldest problems in warfare. When you line up hundreds or thousands of men, give them sharp weapons, poor food, and long campaigns, some will naturally decide that their time would be better spent literally anywhere else. So what happened to them? Well, let's just say the ancient world wasn't exactly lenient. But it was also surprisingly creative in its punishments. Tonight, we'll drift through those punishments and the lives of men who tried, and often failed, to run away from war. The temptation to flee. Before we dive into gruesome details, it's worth remembering why soldiers deserted. Food shortages, unpaid wages, endless marching, being drafted against your will, or simply not wanting to die in some distant valley on behalf of a general who already had 3 villas and a very healthy wine collection. Some deserted before battle. Others slipped away during a long campaign. A few even bolted in the middle of combat, though that was a dangerous time to test your sprinting ability. Desertion was always a risk. Because while your commanders could never fully prevent it, they could certainly make examples of those caught. Ancient Greece, cowards and exiles. In the Greek city-states, the citizen soldier was supposed to fight for his polis out of loyalty. Abandoning your post was not just a crime, it was a disgrace. In Athens, a deserter could lose his citizenship, which meant losing your voice in politics, your right to own property, and any chance of marrying respectably. You became a kind of living ghost, officially dishonored. Other cities went further. Some deserters were executed. Others were publicly shamed, paraded in women's clothing, for example. Because nothing says never do this again like forcing a would-be hoplite to shuffle home in a dress while the neighbors laugh. Sparta, of course, was harsher. A Spartan who fled battle was disgraced for life. He couldn't hold public office. He might be forced to sit apart in public gatherings. He was expected to wear mismatched clothing, visible proof that he had failed. His family bore the shame too. In a society obsessed with military honor, desertion was practically social death. Rome, disciplined by fear. And then there were the Romans. If Greece punished desertion with shame, Rome punished it with creative violence. Roman armies relied on discipline, and the generals had plenty of ways to enforce it. One of the most infamous was decimation. If a unit was guilty of cowardice or desertion, the commander ordered 1 in 10 men killed by their own comrades. Picture it. The unlucky soldiers are chosen by lot. They're beaten to death with clubs and stones, while the other 9 stand by, learning a very vivid lesson in loyalty. It was brutal, but the Romans swore it kept discipline ironclad. Individual deserters fared no better. They might be flogged, stoned, or forced to run the gauntlet, a tunnel of fellow soldiers who beat them as they staggered through. Sometimes, their hands were cut off. Sometimes, they were crucified. And yet, soldiers still deserted, especially during long campaigns when food ran out or pay was delayed, which, in Rome, was fairly often. Even the harshest punishments couldn't stop the simple fact that humans dislike starvation and arrows. Desertion in the East. Let's drift eastward. In the Persian Empire, soldiers drafted from the far corners sometimes tried to vanish on their long marches. Punishments included mutilation, cutting off ears or noses, or execution. But some deserters were simply enslaved instead. In China, desertion was also harshly punished. During the Qing Dynasty, deserting could mean execution for the soldier, and sometimes his family, too. Later dynasties introduced punishments like tattooing deserters on the face, so everyone would know. A permanent mark of shame, and a handy way to prevent repeat offenses. The Mongols, centuries later, were even more direct. Desertion meant death. Usually swift, sometimes inventive. Genghis Khan didn't really go in for second chances. What if you actually got away? Of course, not everyone was caught. Some deserters slipped back to their villages, hoping to disappear. Others joined bandit groups, or even switched sides to the enemy. In some cases, they were welcomed. Ancient armies were often desperate for manpower. If you ran from one side and turned up on the other, offering your sword, you might be accepted. It wasn't exactly noble, but it worked. Still, deserters lived with risk. If captured later, they could face punishment not just for desertion but for treason, which tended to be worse. Cowardice versus self-preservation. It's tempting to think of deserters as cowards. That's certainly how commanders painted them. But for many soldiers, desertion wasn't about cowardice, it was about survival. A Greek farmer drafted into war might not see why he should die to protect his general's pride. A Roman soldier stuck on half rations for months might decide that desertion was more rational than loyalty. And a Chinese conscript, facing impossible odds, might prefer to take his chances back home. History tends to record the punishments. But behind those punishments were men who simply wanted to live. The irony of leaders. And here's a final thought. While deserters were punished brutally, generals themselves sometimes walked away from disaster with surprisingly little consequence. A Roman consul who lost an army might face disgrace, but rarely crucifixion. A Greek general might be exiled, only to be recalled later. So the ordinary soldier faced death for running, while the leaders often strolled off to write memoirs. A small irony, though perhaps not surprising. History has always been kinder to the powerful. A quiet picture. So let's close our eyes and imagine it. The campfire is burning low. A soldier lies awake, staring at the stars. His boots are worn through. His stomach is empty. Tomorrow, he'll be ordered to march again, or to fight in a battle he doesn't believe in. Somewhere in the night, he thinks about slipping away. Just walking until the campfires are behind him. Back to his village, his family, his own bed. But he knows the risk. If he's caught, it won't just be shame. It will be the lash, the stones, maybe worse. And so he stays. For now. Because in ancient armies, desertion wasn't just leaving the fight. It was gambling your life on whether anyone noticed you were gone. And with that, we'll leave the soldiers by their fires. Tomorrow, they'll march again. But tonight, we can let them rest. Next, we might wander back into the palaces, where royals were making messes of their own lives in ways just as dramatic, if slightly better cushioned. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're not trudging through muddy fields or marching in sandals. Tonight, we're sitting in cold, echoing palaces. The kind with too many drafty hallways, too much expensive furniture, and families who spent centuries marrying their cousins. We're going to drift gently into the world of royal inbreeding. Because if there's one thing European monarchs loved more than velvet capes and uncomfortable chairs, it was marrying within the family. Why? Well, mostly to keep power, land, and titles neatly contained. But the result, generation after generation, was a genetic cocktail with fewer ingredients than a glass of tap water. So let's explore some of the most inbred monarchs in history. Quietly, gently, and with just a touch of irony. Because some of these rulers were given titles like the fair or the handsome, while resembling, at best, a damp sponge. The Habsburg Qing. We'll begin with the dynasty that perfected inbreeding as an art form, the Habsburgs. For centuries, the Habsburg family ruled much of Europe, Austria, Spain, parts of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire. They expanded their empire not so much by conquest as by careful marriage alliances. Or, to put it more bluntly, by repeatedly marrying their cousins. The result was a dynasty famous for its Habsburg jaw. Generations of intermarriage left many of them with oversized lower jaws, jutting chins, and difficulty chewing. The most notorious example was Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles was the end product of 200 years of increasingly narrow family trees. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were themselves close relatives. By the time Charles was born, his family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a very determined shrub. Charles II struggled with health from the beginning. He was weak, sickly, and infertile. He had the Habsburg jaw so severely that he could barely speak or chew. He suffered from epilepsy, developmental delays, and a body so fragile that one courtier described him as a walking corpse. Despite this, he was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because many believed his misfortunes were caused by sorcery. In reality, they were caused by centuries of cousins saying I do to one another. Charles died childless at just 38, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. His will passed the throne to the French Bourbons, who probably thanked him, politely, for his service to genetics. The tragic Habsburgs of Austria. But the Spanish branch wasn't alone. The Austrian Habsburgs also married into themselves with determination. Emperor Leopold I, for instance, was both uncle and cousin to various relatives, a multitasker of inbreeding. His children inherited the signature jaw, as well as other health issues. By the 18th century, the dynasty had dwindled into fragile heirs and frequent infant deaths. It's a reminder that keeping land united sometimes meant keeping the gene pool alarmingly shallow. England and the Plantagenet problem. Let's drift over to England for a moment. The Plantagenet dynasty, while not as famously inbred as the Habsburgs, still dipped liberally into the cousin marriage pool. King Richard II married his cousin Anne of Bohemia. Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville, whose family ties overlapped with his own. Over generations, noble families recycled the same bloodlines, like an endlessly repeated recipe that keeps turning out worse each time. And while England avoided anything quite as dramatic as the Habsburg Qing, it did produce fragile heirs, short reigns, and a general tendency toward dynastic drama. The Bourbon experiment. The French Bourbons also indulged in cousin marriages, though not quite as obsessively as the Habsburgs. Still, they kept things close enough to produce weak heirs now and then. Louis XIV, the Sun King, managed to shine despite it, ruling for over 70 years. But his descendants weren't so lucky. By the time of Louis XVI, the one who lost his head, there were plenty of signs of inherited frailty. Not quite to Charles II levels, but enough to keep royal doctors busy. The isolated royals of Portugal. Portugal, too, has its stories. King Afonso VI of Portugal, for example, suffered paralysis on one side of his body and mental instability, likely the result of intermarriage. He was eventually declared incapable of ruling, and his younger brother politely stepped in. In some ways, he was fortunate. Unlike Charles II, Afonso at least had the option of retiring to a quiet palace. Russian royal oddities. In Russia, the Romanovs intermarried with German and Austrian royals, which eventually imported the same problems. The most famous was hemophilia, a bleeding disorder carried by Queen Victoria of Britain and spread across Europe through her many children and grandchildren. Tsarevich Alexei, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, suffered from it. A small cut could threaten his life. His illness helped give Rasputin, the mysterious mystic, influence over the royal family, because Rasputin seemed able to ease his pain. So here, inbreeding didn't produce a jaw or infertility. Instead, it introduced a hidden weakness that played a role in the empire's collapse: the Spanish Bourbon return. Interestingly, after the Spanish Habsburgs died out with Charles II, the Bourbons who replaced them continued the habit of close marriages. And so, Spain's royal family circled back into familiar problems: sickly heirs, poor health, and fragile dynasties. History, it seems, is fond of repeating itself, sometimes with a limp. Why did they do it? At this point, you might be wondering, why keep doing this? Didn't they notice? The answer is, yes, but also no. They noticed the heirs were weak. They noticed the infant deaths, but dynastic marriage wasn't about health. It was about power. Marrying your cousin meant land stayed in the family. It meant fewer disputes over inheritance. It meant unity. Genetics, unfortunately, was not a science they understood. They believed illnesses came from curses, bad air, or witchcraft. The idea that marrying your niece might cause your grandson to collapse like a poorly built pastry simply didn't occur to them. A quiet picture. So let's picture it. A grand, echoing palace. A royal nursery filled with carved cradles, tapestries, and anxious servants. Inside, a pale child lies weakly under blankets, his jaw too heavy, his body too frail. Outside, courtiers whisper about curses and witches. They never whisper the truth, that centuries of narrowed family trees are slowly withering their dynasty. And yet, even as this child struggles, another royal marriage is being arranged. Another cousin wedding, another layer added to the tangle. The cycle continues, as it always does, until the dynasty collapses under its own weight. The irony of history is that these royal families fought to keep their power pure, and in doing so, they weakened themselves. Their palaces glittered, their crowns shone, but their bloodlines, those were quietly falling apart. And with that thought, let's drift away from the palaces for now. The royals can nurse their chins in peace. Next, perhaps, we'll step back into the streets and ask, what did ordinary medieval towns smell like? Spoiler, not roses.